The fist came out of nowhere. 1 second, Ethan Cole was standing still. The next, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez's open palm slammed into his chest so hard the sound echoed off every wall in that mess hall. And every single one of the 1,040 men in that room went dead silent. Tank smiled. He actually smiled. He had no idea what he had just started. Because the quiet man he just shoved? He wasn't just a security guard. And before this day was over, Tank Rodriguez, the most feared man on that base, would be lying flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, wondering what just happened to his life. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The morning started the same way every morning started for Ethan Cole. 5:15 a.m. Alarm. Silence. Then the soft sound of little feet padding down the hallway. "Daddy!" Lily's voice, barely 7 years old, still rough with sleep, cut through the dark like the only sound in the world that actually mattered. She appeared in the doorway of his room, her hair a mess, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one fist, her eyes barely open. Ethan sat up. He'd already been awake for 20 minutes. He always was. Old habit. The kind of habit that doesn't leave you. Not really. No matter how many years pass or how far you get from the place that built it into you. "Hey, baby girl," he said. His voice was low, calm. The same voice he used for everything. For her, for strangers, for situations that would make most men's hands shake. "You're up early." "I had a dream," she said. Good dream or bad dream? She thought about it, the way only a child can, completely serious, completely honest. "In between," she decided. Ethan almost smiled. He reached out, and she crossed the room and climbed up onto the bed next to him, tucking herself under his arm like she'd done it 10,000 times, because she had. "In-between dreams are the best kind," he told her. "They keep you guessing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to work today?" "Yeah." "Is it going to be a normal day?" He looked down at her. She was already closing her eyes again, already drifting back toward sleep, warm against his side. He didn't answer right away, because something in his chest did a strange thing. A pull, a warning, the kind of instinct that doesn't have a name, but that every man who has ever worn a uniform learns to respect. "Yeah," he said finally. "Normal day." He was wrong, and somewhere beneath the surface, some part of him already knew it. Ethan Cole was 44 years old, and from the outside, there was nothing remarkable about him. He was medium height, lean, but not flashy about it. He had dark eyes that didn't give much away, and a face that had been through enough weather, emotional and literal, to carry a kind of permanent stillness in it. He worked as a security supervisor at Naval Station Coronado, not on the SEAL teams, not in any operational capacity. He checked credentials, managed access points, ran equipment inspections, coordinated with base personnel on procedural matters. He was, in the eyes of most people who passed him every day, a man who existed in the background. That was fine by Ethan. He hadn't always been background. He'd spent 8 years as an Army combat medic, 3 deployments, 1 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, and had seen things that rewired a person at a level that could never be fully articulated to someone who hadn't been there. He had a Purple Heart he kept in a shoebox under his bed. He had a scar along his left forearm from a piece of shrapnel that had come within 2 inches of ending his story entirely. And he had a daughter, Lily, whose mother had walked out when Lily was 18 months old, leaving Ethan with a baby, a discharge that was technically honorable, but emotionally complicated, and the quiet, absolute certainty that the only mission that mattered now was raising that little girl right. So he found the job at Coronado, which paid decently and kept him close to the military world he knew, without demanding that he be something he was no longer trying to be. He drove a used Ford F-150. He made Lily's lunches the night before. He read to her every night until she fell asleep. He didn't drink much, didn't date much, didn't talk about himself much. He was the kind of man that most people underestimated, and he never bothered to correct them. That was fine by Ethan. Until the morning, it stopped being fine. The call came in at 7:42 a.m., while Ethan was doing his first equipment check of the day in the supply corridor off Building 6. His radio crackled. "Cole, you copy?" He keyed it. "Copy. We need you in the main mess hall. Commander Holt's orders. They're running a full base coordination exercise starting at 0900, and they want someone from security doing equipment verification before personnel rotate in. Full house today. All companies." Ethan looked at his clipboard. He had 2 other checks scheduled before 9. "What's the personnel count?" A pause. "Approximately 1,040. It's a combined training day." Ethan processed that. 1,040 men. Every company on the base, pulled together for a single training exercise. That was not a normal morning. 10-4, he said. "I'll be there in 10. He walked to the mess hall with his kit bag over one shoulder and his clipboard in hand, moving the way he always moved. Steady, unhurried, taking everything in without looking like he was taking everything in. He nodded to 2 junior enlisted guys near the door. He checked the equipment staging area along the east wall, running through the checklist methodically. Water stations, communication units, med kit placements, emergency exit clearance. The hall was filling up. Men were coming in by the dozens, in their utilities, voices rising, the low rumble of 1,000 different conversations, layering over each other like weather. Ethan worked through his list and paid the crowd no particular attention. He was on the 3rd item of his secondary check when he heard the voice. It was the kind of voice that preceded its owner into a room the way thunder precedes lightning. Deep, carrying, deliberately loud. The voice of a man who had decided a long time ago that volume was a form of authority. "Out of the way! Move!" Ethan didn't look up. "I said move, people! Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, coming through. You want to stand in my lane? That's your problem, not mine." A ripple moved through the crowd near the main entrance. Men stepped aside. Not because they were ordered to, not formally, but because when Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez walked into a room, it was easier to move than to become a story he told later. Ethan had heard of Tank Rodriguez. Everyone on base had. The man was a SEAL with 15 years in, 2 combat deployments, a Silver Star, a reputation for PT scores that bordered on myth, and an ego that had grown at roughly the same rate as his legend. He was 38 years old, 6'2", 230, and he moved through a crowd the way a truck moves through a chain-link fence. Not aggressively, exactly, just with a complete and total lack of concern for anything in his way. He was the kind of man who had been told he was exceptional so many times by so many people in positions of authority that he had quietly stopped questioning it and simply begun to live inside the assumption as though it were a law of physics. He was also, Ethan would come to understand in the next 15 minutes, the kind of man who confused invincibility with immunity. Ethan was crouched near the east wall, adjusting the bracket on a communication relay unit, when he heard the footsteps stop behind him. "Hey!" He finished the adjustment and stood, turning around. Tank Rodriguez was looking at him with the expression of a man who had found an obstacle in an inconvenient location. Not angry, not even irritated really. More like mildly put out. like he'd found a trash can in the wrong spot. "You're in the staging lane," Tank said. "We need that for equipment deployment." Ethan looked at the floor. He was 6 inches outside the designated staging lane, marked with yellow tape on the floor. The relay unit he'd just adjusted was in the lane, yes, but it was on the approved equipment checklist that had been cleared by Commander Holt's office 3 days ago. "I'm on the commander's equipment checklist," Ethan said. "This unit's on the pre-X inspection manifest. I'll be done in 4 minutes. Tank's expression didn't change. He looked at Ethan the way men like him look at men like Ethan, when men like Ethan fail to immediately accommodate them. With a particular brand of contempt that is less about the specific situation and more about a deep, ingrained belief that some people simply exist to make way. "I don't care about your manifest," Tank said. "I care about my staging lane. Move the equipment." "It'll take me 4 minutes," Ethan said again. His voice was even. His face was even. There was no challenge in it, but there was no retreat either. "Commander Holt's office cleared this equipment placement. If you have an issue with it, you can radio his office and they'll confirm." The 2 men looked at each other for a moment. Around them, the noise of the mess hall continued. Most people nearby hadn't noticed yet. A few had. Then Tank did something that Ethan had not anticipated. He laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh or a long one. It was a short, quiet laugh. The kind that isn't really about humor at all, but about dismissal. About reducing someone to a punchline without going to the trouble of writing the joke. "You know what you are?" Tank said, his voice dropping just enough to be private between them, but pitched just loud enough that the 3 or 4 guys closest could hear. "You're a rent-a-cop, standing in my staging lane, telling me about a manifest." He let the word hang in the air like smoke. "Brother, I've been a SEAL for 15 years. I've been in places you can't even find on a map. And you're standing here with a clipboard telling me to wait 4 minutes." Another quiet laugh. "Move. The equipment. Now." Ethan looked at him. He didn't move. "I'm not going to do that," Ethan said quietly. "I'm doing my job, and I'll be finished in 4 minutes. You can wait, or you can call the commander's office." The laughter left Tank's face like a light being switched off. Something else came into it. Something colder. "You want to run that by me one more time?" Tank said. "I said I'm not going to move the equipment," Ethan repeated. Same tone, same volume. Calm, clear, absolute. "If you'd like to resolve this with Commander Holt's office, I'm happy to stand by while you make that call." The men nearby had gone quiet. Tank took 1 step forward. Just one. But it changed the geometry of the whole situation, closing the distance between them from conversational to something else entirely. "Let me explain something to you about how this works," Tank said. His voice was no longer dismissive. It was instructional now, in the way that a man explains something to someone he has decided is beneath explanation, but enjoys the process anyway. When a staff sergeant of the United States Navy tells a security contractor to move, the security contractor moves. That's not a request. That's the way this base functions. That's the way any base functions. You understand what I'm telling you? "I understand what you're telling me," Ethan said. "And I'm telling you that I'm operating under orders from Commander Holt's office, which outranks your preference for your staging lane. I'm not a contractor. I'm base security staff, and my equipment placement has been cleared. You can verify that in about 30 seconds if you want to make the call." A vein appeared at Tank's temple. Just a small one. The kind that appears when a man is maintaining control by will alone, and the will is starting to cost him. "You got a real mouth on you," Tank said softly. "For a medic." Ethan went still. Not visibly, No one watching would have seen anything change. But something in him went still, the way the air goes still before something breaks. Because Tank couldn't have known that, not unless he'd been briefed on Ethan's file, or had asked around, or, and this was the option that tasted worst, had done it deliberately. Had done his homework specifically to find the one word that would get inside and unsettle. Medic. Said like an insult. Said like a reduction. Said like the 7 years Ethan spent keeping men alive in the worst places on earth were nothing but a punchline attached to a clipboard. Ethan breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. An old technique. Slow. Invisible. "We're done talking," Ethan said. "I've explained my position. If you want to escalate this, the commander's number is 7734. Otherwise, I'll be finished in 4 minutes." He turned back to the relay unit. He heard Tank move. What happened next happened fast, and several people would describe it differently later, but they would all agree on the core of it. Tank's hand came forward and connected with Ethan's shoulder. Hard, flat-palmed, a shove designed not to injure, but to dominate, to make a point, to make a man stumble, to make a man feel small in front of a crowd. The sound of it cut through the noise in the hall like a gunshot, and for 1 full second, just one, the entire mess hall went quiet. 1,040 men, every company on the base, all of them, in that single second, aware that something had happened. Heads turning, conversations stopping, eyes moving to the east wall, where a staff sergeant had just put his hands on a man who was not looking at him anymore. Ethan caught his balance. He hadn't fallen. He'd been pushed, and he'd caught himself, and now he stood with his back still half turned to Tank, and his hands very still at his sides. He was quiet for a long moment. When he turned around, his face was the same face it had been the entire time. No rage, no fear, no emotion at all. Or rather, no emotion that Tank would have recognized, because the thing on Ethan's face now was not the blank absence of feeling. It was the presence of something that had no use for drama. Something that had been places drama couldn't survive. Absolute focus. "You just put your hands on me," Ethan said. His voice was completely quiet. "On a base facility employee in the performance of authorized duties, in front of approximately 1,000 people. Tank's jaw was set. His eyes were hard. But something in them, just a flicker, had shifted. "I suggest," Ethan said, still in that same quiet, final voice, "that you take a breath, step back, and think very carefully about what you just did." Tank stared at him. "Because," Ethan continued, "I'm giving you a way out of this right now, and I won't offer it again." The mess hall was almost completely silent. Tank looked around, looked at the men watching him, looked at the sea of faces, waiting, watching, some of them with expressions that were unreadable, and some of them with expressions that were starting to be readable in ways Tank didn't like. He looked back at Ethan, and then, instead of taking the way out, he smiled. That same smile from before, the one that had looked so easy. The one that said, "I am untouchable, and you are nothing, and everyone in this room knows it." "Or what?" Tank said. Ethan didn't answer. He set his clipboard down on top of the relay unit, very carefully, very deliberately. He turned to face Tank fully, and he took one slow, measured step back to give them both room. "Or this," Ethan said. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be talked about at Naval Station Coronado for a long, long time. Not because of the violence of it, because there was very little violence in the cinematic sense. There was no prolonged fight. There were no theatrics. There was no war cry, no dramatic speech, no moment of telegraphed intention. What happened was fast and clean and almost surgical in its execution. And it was not what anyone in that room expected. Tank came forward with the confidence of a man who had never lost a physical confrontation in his adult life, and had stopped imagining that losing was something that happened to him. He moved like what he was, a trained SEAL, a physically dominant man, a person whose body had been honed by 15 years of the most demanding military training on Earth. He reached for Ethan's collar. He was quick. He was very, very quick. He just wasn't quick enough. Ethan's hands were already moving before Tank's fingers made contact. And what they did, the precise sequence of deflection, redirection, and controlled application of force that followed, was so economical, so completely without wasted motion, that several men who were watching later said it looked like it happened in slow motion. Not because it was slow, but because every single movement was so exact that the eye could follow each piece of it like steps in a sequence that had been designed, tested, and refined over a very long time. Tank's own momentum carried him. Ethan simply adjusted its direction. The first blow, palm heel, short range, applied to the nerve cluster below Tank's right ear, was precise enough that Tank's vision blurred for half a second. Not enough to put a man like that down. Enough to disrupt. The second followed so quickly it was almost simultaneous. Low center of gravity, leverage applied at the knee with a control that looked almost gentle and was, in its effect, completely authoritative. Tank went down. Not stumbling, not staggering, down. One moment standing, the next, with a sound like a large piece of furniture hitting hardwood, on the floor of the mess hall of Naval Station Coronado, in front of 1,040 United States military personnel. He lay there for a moment, blinking. The mess hall was so silent that a man 200 feet away later said he could hear his own breathing. Ethan stood where he was. He hadn't taken a single step forward during any of it. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the silence. He looked at Tank Rodriguez on the floor, and his expression had not changed from the moment this began. Calm, controlled, and carrying that absolute quiet focus that no one in that room had ever seen on the face of the man they knew only as the security supervisor with a clipboard. He bent down, picked up his clipboard from the relay unit, looked back at Tank. 4 minutes, Ethan said quietly. That's all I needed. Then he turned back to his equipment check, and the only sound in the mess hall for the next 10 seconds was the scratch of his pen moving down the list. It was only later, much later, when the shock had time to become something else, that people started asking the question that should have been obvious from the very beginning. Who is this man? Not who he said he was, not the title on his badge or the clipboard in his hand. But who, exactly, was Ethan Cole? And what of the Army made him in those 8 years before he became a man who checked equipment brackets and made his daughter's lunches and read to her until she fell asleep? The answer, it turned out, was complicated, and it was only the beginning of the story. The silence lasted exactly 11 seconds. Ethan counted them without meaning to. Old habit. The kind that gets drilled into a person during the kind of training that doesn't make it into recruitment brochures. 11 seconds, where 1,040 men stood in a mess hall at Naval Station Coronado and collectively forgot how to breathe. Then, someone coughed. And just like that, the room came back to life. Not all at once. It was more like a thaw. Slow at first, individual pockets of sound blooming outward from the edges. Men looking at each other with a particular expression that appears on a person's face when they've witnessed something their brain hasn't fully categorized yet. Not shock exactly, something more disoriented than that. The look of a man who walked into a room expecting one thing and found something else entirely, and is still working out what it means. Tank Rodriguez was getting up. He moved the way a man moves when he's been put down, and is trying to pretend, for the benefit of himself as much as anyone else, that he's simply choosing to be on the floor, and is now choosing to no longer be on the floor. He got one knee under him, then the other, and he rose with the kind of careful, deliberate control that takes enormous effort to maintain when your vision has gone soft at the edges and the base of your skull feels like someone drove a tent peg into it. He stood. He straightened. He turned around. Ethan was already back at the relay unit, pen moving down the checklist. This particular detail was the thing that would stick with the men who were there. Not the takedown. The takedown was stunning, yes, but takedowns had a framework people could understand. What they couldn't understand, couldn't fit into any category they had available, was the fact that the man who had just put Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez on the floor of the mess hall had gone back to his checklist as though the interruption had been minor. As though Tank were a phone call he'd had to step away from, briefly, and had now returned to his work. Like it hadn't cost him a single thing. Like it hadn't even been interesting. Tank stared at the back of Ethan's head. His jaw worked once. A muscle in his cheek twitched. His hands, those enormous, capable hands that had broken boards and submitted opponents and earned every commendation on his record, were hanging at his sides, and they were very slightly shaking. Not from pain, or not only from pain, from something that felt in the burning center of his chest like the first time in 15 years that Marcus Rodriguez had looked at himself from the outside and not immediately liked what he saw. "Hey." His voice came out different than he intended. He'd aimed for cold authority and landed somewhere closer to raw. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Ethan made a mark on the clipboard, didn't turn around. "You don't just—" Tank stopped. Started again. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Ethan finished the mark, set the pen in the clipboard's spring clip. Then, with the same unhurried deliberateness that had characterized every single one of his movements since this started, he turned around. He looked at Tank. He waited. Tank opened his mouth, closed it. The speech he'd been forming in the 3 seconds since he stood up. The response, the counter, the reassertion of authority that his mind had been reaching for instinctively, the way a drowning man reaches for anything solid, dissolved. Because the thing about Ethan Cole's face, the thing that was becoming clearer to everyone in that room by the second, was that it offered nothing. No anger, no triumph, no condescension, no fear. Nothing to grab onto, nothing to push back against, nothing that would give Tank the friction he needed to rebuild what he'd just lost. Looking at Ethan right now was like trying to start a fight with a wall. "You have no idea," Tank said, and his voice had dropped to something private and dangerous. "What you just did." "I have a clear idea," Ethan said. "You shoved me. I responded. I'm a staff sergeant of the United States Navy SEALs. I know who you are." "Then you know what happens next." "I know what you think happens next," Ethan said. "And I know what actually happens next. They're not the same thing." The two men stared at each other across about 4 feet of mess hall floor, and the crowd around them, which had been trying to look like it wasn't watching, and failing completely, was very, very still. Petty Officer First Class Darren Webb, who had been standing near the water station about 15 feet away, would tell the story later to anyone who would listen, which turned out to be most of the base. He would describe this moment, these specific seconds, as the moment the room changed. Not when the takedown happened. Not when Tank hit the floor. This moment. This quiet exchange between two men, where one of them was radiating authority like a furnace, and the other one simply stood there, looking at him, unmoved. And the authority hit him and slid off and disappeared. "You're going to regret this," Tank said. "Maybe," Ethan said. "But not today." He turned back to the relay unit. He picked up his pen. He made the next mark on the checklist. And Tank Rodriguez, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, had absolutely no idea what to do. It was Master Chief Leon Garrett who stepped in. He came through the crowd the way senior enlisted men move, with a kind of gravity that parts people without requiring them to be told to move, an authority that is physical in its effect, even when there's nothing physical about it. He was 51 years old, with 30 years in the Navy, and he had a face like a topographical map of every hard thing he'd survived. He'd seen a lot. He'd seen more than a lot. And in 30 years of watching men and their particular brands of stupidity and greatness, he'd developed an ability to read a room in about 4 seconds that had saved lives on more than one occasion. He read this room in 3. He put himself between Tank and Ethan without making a production of it, which was an art form in itself. He looked at Tank. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked back at Tank. "Rodriguez," he said. Quiet. Even. The voice of a man who is completely in control and doesn't need volume to demonstrate it. Tank looked at him. Something in Tank's expression, the hot, exposed thing that had been sitting on the surface of his face for the past 2 minutes, pulled back. Not fully, but enough. "Master Chief," Tank said, "you good?" The question was so perfectly calibrated, so exactly the right instrument for the moment, that Ethan, pen still moving down the checklist, almost smiled. "You good." Not what happened, or what did you do, or are you injured, but simply, "You good?" Giving Tank the one thing a man in that position needed more than anything else. A door. Tank's jaw tightened. "Fine," he said. "Good." Garrett nodded once, slowly. "Then I need you to take your team to staging area 3. They're waiting on you." Not a suggestion. Not an order. Just a fact, delivered in a tone that left no room for alternatives. Tank looked past Garrett at Ethan. One more look, long and flat, and carrying everything that hadn't been said. Everything that wouldn't be said, not here, not now, but that Tank clearly intended to hold on to. A promise without words. Then he turned and walked away. The crowd exhaled. Garrett watched him go, and then he turned to Ethan, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other. Garrett's eyes were dark and sharp, and they moved over Ethan the way experienced eyes move over something that is more than it appears to be. Cataloging, reassessing, filing. "You the equipment supervisor?" Garrett said. "Security staff. Equipment inspection for the commander's pre-X checklist." "How much more do you have?" Ethan looked at the clipboard. 2 items. "Then finish your 2 items, Garrett said. He paused. "And then you come find me. My office is in Building 4. Ask anyone." Ethan looked at him. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Garrett started to walk away, stopped, turned back, and there was something different on his face now. Not official, not Master Chief, but something more personal than that. Quieter. "What's your background, son?" he said. Ethan met his eyes. "Army, 8 years, combat medic." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Which unit?" Ethan told him. Garrett looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded. One nod, slow and deliberate, with something in it that felt less like acknowledgement and more like recognition. "Finish your checklist," he said. And this time he walked away and didn't come back. Ethan finished the last 2 items on the checklist in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He initialed the bottom of the form, folded it into the clear sleeve on his kit bag, and stood up. He stretched his neck once, left and right. He picked up the kit bag and slung it over his shoulder. He walked to the water station and poured himself a cup of water and drank it slowly. Around him, the mess hall had returned to something approximating normal, in the way that a room returns to normal after an earthquake. People talking, moving, resuming the routines of the morning, but with a new awareness underneath everything. A heightened attention to the floor, the walls, the air itself. Groups of men who had been near enough to see were talking in low voices. He caught pieces of it as he passed. "You see the way he moved? That wasn't Army medic training, man. That was..." Heard Rodriguez talking about getting him. "Who is that guy?" He kept walking. He stopped once, near the main doors, when a young specialist, maybe 22, 23, the kind of young that still has surprise in it, stopped him with a look more than a word. "Hey, The kid, Davis, his name tape said, was clearly working up to something. "You're the equipment guy, right? Security?" "That's right." Davis looked at him, then looked at the floor, then back up, with the expression of someone who has decided to say the thing he was already going to say, but needed a second to commit. "What you just did in there," he said. "I've been at this base 3 years. I've watched Sergeant Rodriguez. I've watched him do that to people. The shoving thing, the talk down to you thing." He stopped. "Nobody's ever..." He stopped again. "I just wanted to say, you know." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "You do your job well," Ethan said. "That's enough. That's always enough." He held the kid's gaze for 1 second. "No one gets to take that from you." Davis blinked, nodded, stepped aside. Ethan walked through the door. Building 4 was a 7-minute walk from the mess hall, and Ethan spent it the way he spent most things, inside his own head, thinking clearly, without the interference of emotion. Not because he didn't feel things. He did. He felt plenty. But he'd spent years learning the difference between feeling something and being run by it, and that distinction had saved his life more than once in circumstances that made this morning look like a minor inconvenience. He thought about Tank, not with anger, with something more like assessment. The man was skilled, genuinely skilled. Ethan had felt the quality of his movement in those few seconds of contact, the speed and the training behind it, and had adjusted accordingly. But skill and wisdom weren't the same thing, and Tank had spent so long in a world that worshipped the first and rarely required the second, that the gap between them had grown into something structural, something foundational. He thought about the way Tank had said medic, that particular tone of dismissal, designed to diminish. He thought about the 8 years that word represented, the weight of it, the men he'd kept breathing who might not have breathed otherwise. The specific, unsentimental courage required to run toward the place where people were dying, rather than away from it. To arrive with your hands instead of a weapon, and make those hands enough. Medic. Said like it was less than. Ethan had met a lot of men in his life who confused loudness with strength, title with ability, size with power. He'd met them in the army and out of it, and they were always, underneath the noise, the same thing. Afraid. Afraid of the possibility, however remote, that the story they'd been telling about themselves might not be the whole story. That the thing they'd staked their identity on was not, in fact, unassailable. Tank Rodriguez had that fear in him. Ethan had seen it the second the man's overconfidence cracked. That flicker in the eyes, brief and quickly covered, that said, "This isn't how this goes." He didn't feel satisfaction about it. He felt something closer to sadness. He walked into Building 4 and found Master Chief Garrett's office on the second floor, third door on the left. The door was open. Garrett was behind his desk, not on the phone, not doing paperwork, just sitting with his coffee and looking at the door like he'd been expecting Ethan at exactly this moment. "Shut the door," Garrett said. Ethan shut it. He stood in front of the desk. "Sit down," Garrett said. Ethan sat. Garrett looked at him for a moment. The same cataloging look from the mess hall, but less guarded now, more direct. He set his coffee down and leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. And there was something in his posture that said, "This is a conversation, not a debrief, not an interrogation. Something else." "I'm going to ask you something," Garrett said, "and I want a straight answer." "All right." "What you did in there, the way you did it, where does that come from?" Ethan held his gaze. "Training," he said. "Army combatives. Some additional work after I got out." "Additional work," Garrett repeated. The two words had a weight to them, like he was testing their density. "What kind of additional work?" "Private instruction. Brazilian jiu-jitsu, some Krav, some other things." He paused. "I had time after my discharge, and a reason to stay sharp." "What kind of reason?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I have a daughter," he said. 7 years old. Single father. There are a lot of reasons when you're raising a kid alone to make sure you're never the kind of man who can't protect what matters." Garrett looked at him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between men who have both been through enough that they don't need to fill every gap with noise. "Rodriguez is going to push back on this," Garrett said. "You understand that." "I expected that. He's got friends, officers, people who are used to looking the other way when he gets like this because his numbers are good and his record is clean on paper." Garrett's voice was completely flat, carrying no judgment in either direction, just information. "He's going to say you provoked him. He's going to say the physical contact was mutual. He's going to build a story." "He can build whatever story he wants," Ethan said. "There were 1,040 witnesses." Garrett almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was there. "That's going to help you," he said. "And it's going to make this more complicated at the same time. Because when something happens in front of that many people, it doesn't stay inside the chain of command. It becomes a thing that the base talks about. And when the base talks about it, it lands on Commander Holt's desk. And when it lands on his desk, he has to make a decision that isn't just about what's right. It's about what's manageable." He let that sit for a second. "You follow me?" "I follow you." "So what I'm asking you, right now, before any of that starts..." Garrett leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked at Ethan with something that had moved past professional interest into something more direct, more personal. "Is whether there's anything in your background that changes the equation. Anything that someone going through your file would find that would make your side of this harder to defend." Ethan thought about the shoebox under his bed, the Purple Heart, the discharge paperwork, the name of the unit he'd served with in Afghanistan, the one that was on Garrett's radar the moment he heard it, the one that made the Master Chief look at him the way he'd looked at him. "My discharge was honorable," Ethan said. "My record is clean. My certifications are current. Everything in my file is exactly what it looks like." "And what does it look like?" Garrett said. "It looks like a man who served his country, raised his daughter, and goes home every night." Ethan paused. "That's all it is." Garrett sat back. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the wall for a moment, and Ethan had the sense that the man was running calculations that were more complex than anything on the surface of this conversation. Weighing things, measuring distances, thinking 3 moves ahead, the way old enlisted men learn to think when they've been around long enough to see how things go wrong. "The unit you named," Garrett said, still looking at the wall. "75th Ranger Regiment." "3rd Battalion." "That's right." "3 deployments." "Yes." "And after that, how long before the security job here?" 2 years. Garrett turned back to look at him. "Doing what in those 2 years?" Ethan met his eyes. "Taking care of my daughter," he said. "And training." The Master Chief held his gaze for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not softening, exactly, but landing. Settling. Like a judgment that had been forming for the last 20 minutes had finally found its conclusion. "All right," Garrett said quietly. He set down his coffee. "Here's what's going to happen. Rodriguez is going to file a formal complaint within the next 2 hours. When he does, you'll be asked to make a statement. You give the statement, you give it straight, you don't editorialize, and you make sure every word of it is exactly what happened. Not what you felt, not what he said, what happened." He held up one finger. "Then you go home, you have dinner with your daughter, and you come back tomorrow and do your job." Ethan nodded. "And Cole." Garrett's voice was the same, flat, even, informational. But the thing underneath it had changed, had become something more personal, something that had nothing to do with authority or rank or the official shape of this conversation. "The unit you were with, 3rd Battalion. Were you in country during Kunar Province, spring of '09? The room was very still. Ethan looked at him. "Yes," he said. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Specialist Danny Garrett," the Master Chief said. His voice had changed completely. It was still controlled. This was a man who had decades of practice keeping control. But the control was working harder now. Visibly harder. He was 23 years old. IED, Route, Michigan, April 14th. Ethan felt something move through him. The specific cellular weight of a name. Of a day. Of a choice made under fire that had consequences he never got to know the end of. He looked at Garrett. "I was there," Ethan said. Garrett looked at him for a very long time. His jaw was tight. His eyes were steady. In those eyes was everything that a father carries when he's been carrying it for 15 years without a place to put it down. "He made it," Garrett said. "My son made it." His voice was barely above a whisper. "They told us later there was a medic who didn't leave him, who stayed in the road and kept working until the medevac came. They told us his name, but the report was classified, and by the time it wasn't..." He stopped. Ethan was completely still. "That was you," Garrett said. Not a question. "Yes," Ethan said. The room held that between them for a long moment. The weight of it. The strange, impossible geometry of the world that put a man in a mess hall checklist and a different man in the office upstairs, and wound a thread between them back 15 years to a road in Kunar Province and a 23-year-old specialist who had needed someone to stay. Master Chief Leon Garrett, 30 years in the Navy, put his hand flat on the desk. He breathed in through his nose. He looked at the wall for just a moment, and when he looked back, his eyes were clear and his voice was steady, and there was something in his face that was simply, quietly, unmistakably grateful. "Whatever happens with Rodriguez," Garrett said, "I want you to know. Whatever comes at you from this, and something will come, you're not going to face it alone." Ethan nodded, just once. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things don't live in words, and both men in that room knew exactly which ones they were. Outside Building 4, the morning continued. Men moved between buildings. Training exercises were underway. The base went on the way bases go on, grinding forward through its routines and its hierarchies and its particular brand of organized intensity. And somewhere on the other side of the base, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez was sitting with his team and his damaged pride, and the story he was already building, brick by brick, word by word. A story designed to restore what he'd lost in 11 seconds on a mess hall floor. He had no idea what he was walking into. Neither, in some ways, did Ethan. But Ethan had spent a long time learning that the thing coming toward you was rarely the thing you needed to be afraid of. The thing you needed to watch was what you were carrying, what you were protecting, what was worth protecting. And tonight, he was going to go home and make Lily's dinner and read to her until she fell asleep. And tomorrow, he was going to come back and do his job. That was enough. For now, that was everything. Ethan walked out of Building 4 at 10:47 in the morning, and the base looked exactly the same as it had 2 hours ago. That was always the thing about significant moments. The world didn't acknowledge them. The sun didn't shift. The buildings didn't rearrange themselves. Men walked past in their utilities, talking about lunch and training schedules and the basketball game from the night before. And none of them knew that something had changed in Ethan Cole's life in the last 2 hours, in ways he hadn't yet fully mapped. The conversation with Garrett sat in his chest like something warm and heavy. Not uncomfortable, but present. The kind of present that demanded acknowledgement, even when you weren't ready to give it. Danny Garrett had made it. Ethan had never known. He'd done what he'd always did on that road in Kunar province. He'd stayed. He'd worked. He'd refused the math that said the medevac wasn't coming in time. And then the medevac came and took Danny away, and took Ethan's certainty away with it. For 15 years he'd carried the not knowing the way you carry any open question. Not always in the front of your mind, but always in the building, always taking up space. And now it had a different weight, a resolved weight. He let himself feel it for exactly 1 block. Then he put it somewhere it could wait, because the rest of the morning wasn't going to wait. And Garrett had been right about the timeline. Rodriguez was going to move fast. Men like that always did. When they lost something in public, the instinct to recover it was immediate and total, like a reflex that bypassed thought entirely. He was right. His radio crackled at 11:15. "Cole, this is Lieutenant Commander Marsh's office. We need you in Admin Building 2. 1400 hours. Ethan keyed it. "Copy that. 1400. He had 2 hours and 45 minutes. He spent the first hour finishing the rest of his equipment rounds, moving through the base with his clipboard and his kit bag, doing the job the same way he always did it. Methodical. Thorough. Not because he was performing normalcy, but because the work was real and it mattered, and he wasn't the kind of man who let someone else's behavior interrupt his own standards. He spent the second hour in the small break room off the security corridor, eating a sandwich he'd made that morning at 6 a.m., while Lily ate her cereal and told him about a book she was reading at school, about a girl who discovered she could talk to horses. He ate the sandwich and thought about Lily's face when she described the horse book, that particular intensity children bring to things that have genuinely captured them, the way their whole body orients toward the thing they love. And he felt, sitting in that break room, while the bass hummed around him, the specific clarity of purpose that Lily had given him without meaning to. He knew what mattered. He'd known it since she was 18 months old, and her mother drove away, and Ethan stood in the parking lot of his apartment complex holding a toddler who was too young to understand what had just happened. And he'd looked down at her and made a decision so complete and so permanent that it had never been a question since. He was going to be enough for her. He was going to be more than enough. Whatever the world threw at him, he was going to stand in it, the way he'd stood in the mess hall this morning. Steady, clear, unafraid. And she was going to grow up, knowing that her father was a man who didn't run from hard things. At 13:55, he walked into Admin Building 2. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Marsh was 46, career Navy, with a background in JAG that had shaped her into something precise and efficient, and remarkably difficult to read. She ran the Administrative Adjudication Office at Coronado, with the energy of a person who has long since stopped being impressed by rank and started being impressed only by truth, which made her either the best or worst person Ethan could have ended up in front of, depending on whose side you were on. She was sitting behind her desk when Ethan was shown in. 2 other people were in the room, a junior officer at a side table with a recording device, and a man Ethan didn't recognize in civilian clothes, sitting against the wall with a legal pad. "Mr. Cole," Marsh said, "take a seat." He sat. "You understand this is a formal statement process, related to an incident in the mess hall this morning at approximately 09:20. "I understand." "You're not facing any charges at this time. This is information gathering. You have the right to have a representative present. Do you wish to exercise that right?" "No," Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment. "All right." She folded her hands on the desk. "Tell me what happened, start to finish. Your own words." Ethan told her. He did exactly what Garrett had advised. Flat, sequential, precise. The equipment check. The staging lane. The exchange with Rodriguez. The shove. His response. What he said afterward. What Rodriguez said. The arrival of Master Chief Garrett. He didn't editorialize. He didn't characterize. He gave her the architecture of the event without furniture, just the load-bearing walls. When he finished, Marsh was quiet for a moment. She made a note. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's account," she said, "characterizes the physical contact as mutual. He states that you made an aggressive movement toward him first, and that he responded to what he perceived as a physical threat." "That's not accurate," Ethan said. "Can you be more specific?" "He put his hand on me, a shove, open palm, upper chest. I responded to that contact. There was no prior physical contact from my side." He paused. "There were approximately 1,040 witnesses." Marsh's expression didn't change. She made another note. "Were you aware of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's background and record prior to this incident?" "General awareness, his reputation on base." "And did that awareness factor into your response?" Ethan thought about this for exactly as long as it deserved. "It factored into my initial assessment of the situation," he said. "It did not factor into my response. My response was to the physical contact, not to who made it." Marsh looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be deliberate, long enough to be something other than procedural. "Mr. Cole," she said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Not informal, but less official. "I want to ask you something outside the formal record for a moment." She looked at the junior officer. "Pause the recording." The officer paused it. Marsh set her pen down. She looked at Ethan directly. "I've been doing this for 11 years, she said. "I've sat across from a lot of men in a lot of incident proceedings, and I've learned to read what's under what people say." She paused. "You're not afraid." "No," Ethan agreed. "Most people in your position, facing a formal complaint from a man with Rodriguez's record and connections, they're afraid. They're working to manage the outcome." She studied him. "You're not managing anything." "I'm telling you what happened," Ethan said. That's managing the outcome. Something moved across her face that might have been respect, might have been something less definable. Rodriguez has requested a formal review board, she said. He's asking for your security clearance to be suspended, pending investigation, and for your employment to be placed under review. Ethan absorbed that. That's his right, he said. It is. She leaned forward slightly. What I can tell you, and this is not officially part of this process, but I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're walking into, is that Rodriguez has spoken to 2 officers this morning who are prepared to submit character statements on his behalf. Officers with significant influence in how this base operates. She held his gaze. This could get complicated. I appreciate you telling me, Ethan said. Do you have anyone who can speak for you? Character references. People who know your work here. Ethan thought about Garrett. Didn't say it. I'll work on that, he said. She nodded. The formal review will be scheduled within 72 hours. She looked at the officer. Resume recording. The light on the device came back on. Mr. Cole, do you have anything to add to your statement? No, Ethan said. That's the complete account. Thank you. You're free to go. A pause. Resume your normal duties. He stood, picked up his kit bag, walked to the door. Mr. Cole. He turned. Marsh was looking at him with the same unreadable expression, but underneath it, just barely visible, the way you can sometimes see the framework of a building through its walls, was something that was working against its own professionalism to be there. Whatever this review determines, she said, what happened this morning, the way you handled it, that's not nothing. She straightened some papers on her desk. That's all. Ethan held her gaze for 1 second. Then he nodded and walked out into the afternoon. The call came at 4:58, while Ethan was pulling out of the base parking lot. Unknown number. He answered it anyway. Mr. Cole? The voice was male, middle-aged, carrying the particular flat confidence of a man accustomed to being the one who initiates contact and never receives it. My name is Commander David Reese. I'm a senior training officer, and I sit on the advisory board for Special Operations personnel at this installation. Ethan merged onto the main road. Commander Reese. I'll be direct with you. I'm calling as a courtesy, not officially. Are you in a position to speak? Go ahead. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez served under my command for 3 years. I know him well. I know his record, and I know his character. A pause. Calculated. I also know what happened this morning. Then you don't need me to describe it, Ethan said. A short silence. What I'm calling to tell you is that pushing this, pursuing the formal review, making this a public matter, isn't going to serve you well. Rodriguez has a history here. He has relationships here. And however this morning looked, the review board is going to see a decorated staff sergeant with a silver star and 15 years of exemplary service against a security staff employee with... Another pause. This one not calculated, deliberate, with a quieter profile. Ethan drove. He let the silence stretch. I see, he said. I'm not threatening you. I'm advising you. There are ways to resolve this informally. Rodriguez is willing to let the whole thing go if... He'll let it go, Ethan said. If what? If you submit a revised statement, acknowledging mutual escalation. Ethan was quiet for 3 full seconds. Commander Reese, he said, with respect, I gave a true statement to Lieutenant Commander Marsh. I'm not going to change it. He kept his voice even, not confrontational, not heated, just exact. Rodriguez put his hands on me in front of more than 1,000 witnesses. I responded. That's what happened. And that's what I said happened. and that's what I'll continue to say happened." He signaled for his turn. If the review board decides that a decorated staff sergeant's word carries more weight than the truth, then that's the board's decision to make. But I'm not going to help that process along by saying something that isn't true. Reese was quiet. "You understand what you're risking," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I do," Ethan said. "Good evening, sir." He ended the call. He sat with the silence of the truck cab for the rest of the drive. The radio was off. Traffic moved around him, and he ran the conversation back through his mind, not with anxiety, but with the same clear-eyed assessment he brought to everything, mapping it, cataloging it, understanding what it told him about the shape of what was coming. Rodriguez wasn't just filing a complaint. He was building infrastructure, calling in favors, constructing the kind of case that isn't really about what happened, but about what could be made to seem most plausible, most manageable, most convenient for the people with the authority to decide. It was, Ethan thought, the same tactic Tank had used in the mess hall. Different venue, different tools, but the same underlying assumption, that the other man would blink, that when enough pressure was applied, the quiet man with the clipboard would look at the cost and decide it wasn't worth it. They were still working from the wrong data. Lily was at the kitchen table when he got home, doing homework with the focused ferocity of a child who has decided that something is going to get done, whether it cooperates or not. She was chewing on her pencil eraser and staring at a math worksheet like it had personally wronged her. "Dad," she said, without looking up. "Hey, baby." "Fractions are stupid." "Fractions are hard," he said. "That's different from stupid." "What's the difference?" He put his kit bag down and came to the table and sat next to her. He looked at the worksheet. He looked at her face, that face that was his mother's eyes and his own jawline, and something that was entirely, completely Lily. 7 years old, and already more herself than most adults he'd ever met. "Stupid means it doesn't make sense and never will," he said. "Hard means you haven't figured it out yet." She considered that. "Fine," she said. "Fractions are hard." "Good. Show me the one that's getting you." She pointed at the problem. He looked at it. He talked her through it the same way he talked through everything. Clear, patient, taking the thing apart and putting it back together in a way she could follow. She got it on the second try, and the look on her face when she wrote the answer, that flash of pure, uncomplicated triumph, was the cleanest thing he'd felt all day. "I got it," she said. "You got it. Can we have spaghetti?" "We can have spaghetti." He made dinner while she finished the worksheet, and they ate at the kitchen table. And Lily told him about her day with the narrative completeness that 7-year-olds bring to everything. No detail too small, no digression too far. All of it delivered with the absolute confidence that the person across the table finds this as significant as she does. Which Ethan did. He always did. At some point, between the story about the thing that happened at recess and the description of what Madison said to Tyler about the horse book, Lily stopped and looked at him. "Are you okay, Dad?" He looked at her. "Why?" "You have your thinking face." "I have a thinking face?" "It's like—" She scrunched her own face very slightly, pressing her lips together and looking slightly inward. "Like that, except yours is cooler." He almost laughed. He actually almost laughed. "I had a hard day at work," he said. "What happened?" He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, chewing spaghetti, completely present, completely attentive, waiting. "Someone was unkind to me," he said, "and I had to decide what to do about it." "What did you do?" "I didn't back down." She nodded slowly, with the gravity of a child processing a serious thing seriously. "That was right," she said. "Yeah?" "Mrs. Hendricks says when someone is unkind, You can choose to be sad, or you can choose to be strong. She twirled some spaghetti on her fork. I think you're always strong. He looked at her for a moment. That pull in his chest again. The same one from this morning, from the dark of his bedroom at 5:15, from every ordinary moment that turned out to be everything. I'm working on it, he said. After dinner, she asked him to read the horse book, and he did, sitting on the edge of her bed with the lamp on, and her tucked under her covers, and the book in his hands. And about 12 pages in, her breathing went deep and slow, and he closed the book and sat there for another minute in the quiet of the room. He thought about Kunar Province, about Danny Garrett, 23 years old, a road in April, the sound of the medevac that he'd kept working toward in his head, even when it hadn't arrived yet. He thought about the specific arithmetic of that day, the variables he'd controlled and the ones he hadn't, the decision to stay when leaving would have been defensible, the hands that had known what to do and done it. He thought about Leon Garrett sitting behind that desk saying he made it, and the 15 years of not knowing collapsing into a single moment. He thought about Tank Rodriguez on the floor of the mess hall, looking up with those hard eyes that had something cracked in them now, something exposed. And he thought about Reese's phone call and the machinery grinding into motion, the favors being called in, the story being built. He thought about Lily's face when she got the fraction right. He stood up. He turned off the lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at his daughter in the dark. Then he went to the kitchen table and sat down with a legal pad and a pen, and he began to write out the complete and total truth of what he was. Every deployment, every commendation, every certification, every decision made under conditions that Tank Rodriguez had never faced and never would. Not defensively, not boastfully, but with the same precision and clarity he brought to his equipment checklists. Because whatever was coming, whatever Reese was building, whatever Rodriguez was promising to the men who owed him favors, it was going to run head first into the thing that had been true about Ethan Cole since long before any of them knew his name. He didn't quit. He had never quit. He had stayed in a road in Kunar Province when quitting would have been human and understandable and survivable. And he had stayed because the man who needed him to stay was still there and still breathing and still worth staying for. That hadn't changed. It wasn't going to change. He wrote until midnight. When he was finished, he read it back once. Then he folded it and put it in an envelope and wrote Master Chief Garrett's name on the front. He didn't know yet exactly how the next 72 hours were going to go. He didn't know which officers were going to sit across from him, or what version of events they'd been handed, or how much of the machinery Reese had managed to put in motion in a single afternoon. What he knew was simpler than any of that. What he knew was what he'd always known. From the army, to the mess hall, to the kitchen table, to this chair at midnight. That the thing that determined how a man came through a hard moment wasn't the size of what was coming at him. It was what he was made of. And Ethan Cole had been tested enough times, in enough places, by enough things that were genuinely worth fearing, to have a very clear answer to that question. Outside, the base was quiet. The ocean moved in the dark the way it always did, indifferent and ancient and entirely unimpressed by the troubles of men. And somewhere across the installation, Tank Rodriguez was in his quarters, building his case brick by careful brick, certain that the weight of his reputation and the reach of his relationships and the simple brute force of 15 years of being Marcus Rodriguez would be enough. He had underestimated Ethan once today. He was doing it again. The envelope was on Garrett's desk by 7:15 the next morning. Ethan had left it with the duty officer at Building 4 before his first equipment round. No note attached, just his name and Garrett's in plain block letters. He didn't know if Garrett would read it before the review. He didn't know if it would matter. But he'd written the truth, and the truth deserved to be somewhere other than a legal pad in his kitchen. And Garrett was the only man on this base who had looked at Ethan Cole. Really looked. Past the clipboard and the badge and the quiet, and seen something worth acknowledging. That was enough reason. He was on his second check of the morning, in the corridor off the Eastern Training Complex, when Darren Webb fell in beside him. Webb was 26, petty officer first class, and he walked with the slightly too casual energy of a man who has something to say and is working up to how to say it. Ethan let him work. They made it about 40 feet before Webb spoke. "I heard about Reese's call," Webb said. Ethan kept walking. "Word travels fast." "This base is small when it wants to be." Webb glanced at him sideways. "I heard he asked you to change your statement." "That's accurate." "And you told him no." "That's accurate too." Webb was quiet for a few steps. "Rodriguez talked to 4 guys from our team last night. I wasn't one of them, but I heard about it afterward." He paused. "He's telling them you attacked him, that you've been looking for a reason to make a name for yourself, that the whole thing was premeditated." Ethan made a mark on his clipboard. "What do the 4 guys think?" "2 of them weren't there. They'll say what Tank tells them to say because that's what you do." Another pause. "The other 2 were in the mess hall." "And?" Webb stopped walking. Ethan took 2 more steps, and then stopped too and turned around. Webb was looking at him with an expression that had worked its way past casual and arrived somewhere more direct, more personal. "They saw it," he said. "I saw it. I was 15 feet away." He held Ethan's gaze. "You didn't move first. He put his hands on you. Everybody standing near that wall knows it." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "I want to say it officially." Webb straightened slightly, and the movement was so precise, so instinctively military, that it reframed the entire exchange. "I want to submit a witness statement, for the review." He paused. "I already talked to 2 other guys who were there, Martinez and Cho. They'll do it too." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Webb was 26 years old, standing in a corridor saying he was willing to put his name on a document that contradicted a staff sergeant with 15 years in and friends in officer country. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that had a cost. And Webb knew what the cost was, and he was standing there anyway. "You understand what that might mean for you," Ethan said. "Not a discouragement, an acknowledgement." "I do," Webb said. "Rodriguez isn't going to forget it." "No," Webb agreed. "He won't." He looked at Ethan steadily. "But I was raised by a man who told me that the difference between a good man and a bad one isn't what he does when it's easy. It's what he does when it costs him something." He shrugged, and the shrug was young and genuine and completely without performance. "This costs me something. That means it counts." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Talk to Lieutenant Commander Marsh's office," he said. "Ask for the formal witness submission process. They'll walk you through it." Webb nodded. "Already got the number." He started to turn, then stopped. "One more thing. There are guys who weren't near the wall, who only heard about it after. And some of them are asking questions. About you, who you are, where you came from." He met Ethan's eyes. "The answer they're getting from the official record isn't the whole picture, is it?" It wasn't a question. Not quite. "No," Ethan said. "It isn't." Webb nodded slowly. "I figured." Then he walked away, and Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment with his clipboard in his hand and something in his chest that he hadn't expected. Something that felt, cautiously and without sentimentality, like the ground under him was more solid than it had been yesterday. The review board convened at 9 a.m. on the 3rd day. Admin Conference Room B. 6 people around the table. Marsh at the head. two officers Ethan didn't know on the left side. A senior enlisted advisor whose name tape read Johansson on the right, and the man in civilian clothes from Ethan's statement session, who turned out to be a base legal advisor named Prentice. The chair at the far end of the table was empty until Ethan was shown in and took it. Rodriguez was in a separate room. They were hearing the accounts independently. Ethan had asked for no representative. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his back straight and his face exactly what it always was. And he gave the board everything he had. Not just the incident account, but the fuller record that Marsh had formally requested the day before. His service history, his certifications, his deployment record, the unit designations that made Johansson, the senior enlisted advisor, sit forward very slightly in his chair when Ethan got to the Ranger Battalion. Marsh walked him through it methodically. The equipment checklist, the conversation, the shove, his response, what he said to Rodriguez afterward, the arrival of Master Chief Garrett. When she finished the formal questions, she looked down at her notes and said, "We've received 3 formal witness statements in addition to your account. Petty Officer First Class Webb, Petty Officer Second Class Martinez, and Petty Officer Second Class Cho. All 3 independently corroborate your account of the initial physical contact." She looked up. All 3 state clearly that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made the first physical contact. "Yes," Ethan said. One of the officers on the left, Commander Tillman, silver-haired, with the expression of a man who has been navigating institutional politics long enough to find them tedious, leaned forward. "Mr. Cole, the question before this board isn't only about the initial contact. It's also about the proportionality of your response. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez characterizes your reaction as excessive. Can you speak to the nature and extent of the physical response you employed?" Ethan looked at him. "I used controlled combative techniques to neutralize a physical threat and bring the situation to an end. The techniques I used were calibrated to avoid serious injury while being sufficient to stop the aggression. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez sustained no injuries requiring medical attention. You were trained in these techniques through your Army service?" "Through my Army service and subsequent private training," Ethan said. "I hold current certifications in defensive tactics, close quarters combatives, and emergency response protocols." Tillman looked at his notes. "Your Army service was as a combat medic." "That's correct. With the 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Battalion, 3 deployments." Tillman looked up. Something in his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, but measurably. The calculation behind his eyes was running different numbers than it had been 60 seconds ago. "That's not a standard medic assignment," he said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." Silence settled over the room for a moment. Then Johansson, the senior enlisted advisor, who had been quiet through most of the session, leaned forward and put his forearms on the table. He was built like a man who had spent 30 years taking hard things seriously, and when he spoke, his voice carried all of it. "I want to ask you something off the procedural record," he said. He glanced at Marsh. She nodded slightly. "In your assessment, man to man, forget the formal language. What happened in that mess hall? Not the sequence of events, the thing underneath it." Ethan looked at him. He took a breath. "A man who has been told he's exceptional for long enough," Ethan said, "starts to believe that the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to him. Not because he's a bad person necessarily, but because nothing has ever stopped him. Nobody's ever said no and meant it." He kept his voice even. "What happened in that mess hall is that someone finally said no and meant it, and he couldn't handle it. And he made a choice that he can't unmake." He paused. "I didn't want any of this. I needed 4 minutes to finish my checklist. That's all I wanted." Johansson looked at him for a long time. Then he sat back. "Thank you," he said. They brought Rodriguez in after Ethan's session, and Ethan waited in a holding area down the hall, sitting on a bench with his kit bag at his feet, listening to the bass going on around him. He'd been in rooms like this before, not literally, but in spirit. The anteroom of the decision. The place where you've done everything you can do, and the outcome is in other people's hands, and the only honest thing left is to sit with that and not pretend otherwise. He thought about his father, briefly, a man who'd spent 22 years in the Army National Guard, and come home to West Texas and raised Ethan with the specific, unsentimental code of a man who believed in work and honesty, and the particular dignity of doing things right, even when no one was watching. His father had been dead 6 years. Ethan missed him in a way that had changed over time, less sharp, more constant, like a frequency you learn to live alongside. He thought about what his father would say, sitting in this hallway. He knew exactly what his father would say. He could hear it in the old man's voice, flat in West Texas and completely without doubt. You told the truth. You stood your ground. The rest of it isn't yours to carry. He almost smiled. The door at the end of the hall opened, and Garrett came through it. Ethan stood. Garrett walked to him with the measured pace of a man who has news and is choosing deliberately how to carry it. He stopped in front of Ethan. He looked at him for a moment. "The review is still in session," Garrett said. "I'm not here to tell you the outcome. I'm here because I read what you wrote." He held up the envelope. Ethan's envelope, the one from midnight. "I read all of it." Ethan waited. "The action at Kunar Province," Garrett said. "Your official record lists it as a standard medevac support situation. That's not what your account describes." "The classified material was above my pay grade," Ethan said. "I wrote what I knew." "What you knew includes 6.5 minutes of direct fire exposure while performing medical intervention on an injured ranger." Garrett's voice was controlled with an effort that was visible. 6.5 minutes, Ethan. He almost never used first names. The use of it now landed differently. "That's not standard. That's—" He stopped. "It needed to be done," Ethan said, simply. Garrett looked at him, the same look from Building 4, but deeper now, reaching back into something that had been sitting behind professional composure for 15 years and was finally, carefully, being allowed to surface. "My son is a structural engineer in Portland," Garrett said. "He has a wife and 2 kids. The oldest one just turned 7. He stopped again. His jaw was tight. "He doesn't know your name. He knows there was a medic. He knows someone stayed." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I told him last night, after I read your account. I called him and I told him." Ethan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. "He asked me to thank you," Garrett said. "He said—" His voice went briefly rough, and he brought it back by will alone. "He said to tell you that his oldest one, the 7-year-old, her name is Grace." The hallway was completely quiet. Ethan felt it move through him, the full weight of it, the specific gravity of 15 years compressed into a name. A 7-year-old named Grace, who existed because he had stayed in a road in April and kept working, and refused the math that said it was already over. A structural engineer in Portland with a wife and 2 kids. A grandfather who had carried the shape of a debt for 15 years without knowing where to put it. He stood with it. He let himself stand with it. "Tell him—" Ethan's voice was steady, but not without effort. "Tell him it was my honor." Garrett nodded. Once. The same nod from Building 4, but fuller now. Complete. They stood together for a moment in the hallway. 2 men with 15 years between them, and a road in Afghanistan, and a story that had been unfinished for a long time, and was now, finally, something else. Then the door at the end of the hall opened again, and a junior officer looked out and said, "Mr. Cole, the board is ready." He walked back into conference room B and took the same chair at the far end of the table and looked at the 6 faces that were going to tell him something about his life. Marsh had a sheet of paper in front of her. She looked at it briefly, then at Ethan. "This board has reviewed all submitted accounts, witness statements, personnel records, and relevant documentation," she said. Her voice was formal, but not cold. "We've reached a unanimous finding." She paused. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's account of the incident is not supported by the preponderance of evidence. 3 independent witness statements, security camera footage from the mess hall east wall, and audio from the base communication system all corroborate your account." She looked up. "The board finds that you acted in reasonable defense of yourself following unprovoked physical contact. No disciplinary action will be taken against you. Your employment status is confirmed, and your security clearance is unaffected." Ethan held very still. "Additionally," Marsh continued, "this board is recommending a formal conduct review for Staff Sergeant Rodriguez based on the pattern of behavior documented in witness statements and cross-referenced with 2 prior informal complaints that were never formally pursued." She set the paper down. "His command has been notified." Tillman, the silver-haired commander who'd asked about proportionality, was looking at Ethan with an expression that had traveled a significant distance from where it started this morning. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I want to say, for the record, that your conduct throughout this process has been exemplary. Not just in the incident itself, in the way you handled everything that followed." Ethan looked at him. "I just told the truth," he said. "That's rarer than it should be," Tillman said. Johansson, the senior enlisted advisor, was looking at his notes. "One more thing," he said. "Off the official record." He looked up. "I served with the 75th, not your battalion, but I knew men from 3rd. He held Ethan's gaze. "I know what those guys were." He paused. "I know what you are." The room was quiet. "Thank you," Ethan said. Rodriguez was in the parking lot when Ethan walked out. Not waiting, or not officially waiting. He was standing near a truck 3 spaces from Ethan's, and when Ethan came through the door, Rodriguez turned and looked at him. And the distance between them was maybe 30 feet, and the afternoon was flat and bright and entirely indifferent. Ethan stopped. Rodriguez looked at him for a long moment. He looked like a man the morning after something significant. Not broken, not demolished, but reduced in some fundamental way. The size was still there, the physical presence, the 15 years of forged capability. But the thing that had powered it, that bedrock certainty, that absolute confidence in his own invulnerability, was different now. Changed. Like a wall that hasn't fallen, but has had something taken out of its foundation. He crossed the lot, stopped about 6 feet from Ethan. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "They're pulling my command certification," Rodriguez said. His voice was flat. The anger had burned down to something else, something quieter and less certain of itself. "Pending review, 60-day suspension." Ethan looked at him. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. And it was true, not sentimental, just true. He didn't take pleasure in it. Rodriguez looked at him like the words didn't make sense. "You're sorry." "You have a 15-year record," Ethan said. "I don't know everything that's in it, but I know enough about what it costs to build that kind of record to know that throwing it away over a staging lane is a waste." He kept his voice even. "That's a waste of what you built. That's what I'm sorry about." Rodriguez stared at him. The muscle in his cheek worked. His jaw was tight. He looked like a man who walked into this parking lot with something to say, and is now finding that the thing he came to say doesn't fit the conversation he's in. I looked you up, Rodriguez said. After. Your full file. He stopped. 3rd Battalion, Kunar Province. Yeah? The medevac record from April '09. Rodriguez held his gaze. That was you? Yes. Garrett's son? Yes. Rodriguez looked at him for a long time. The hard lines of his face were doing something complicated, working through something that clearly had no easy resolution and was not going to find one this afternoon. He looked like a man confronting the specific, unwelcome discovery that the person he dismissed as nothing had been living a life full of the very things he'd built his identity around. I called you a medic, Rodriguez said slowly, like it was an insult. You did. I didn't know. It wouldn't have changed anything, Ethan said. It shouldn't have to. Rodriguez looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, fractured almost. The way a face changes when a man is being honest with himself about something he would rather not be honest about. No, he said quietly. It shouldn't have to. He looked at the ground for a moment. I've been doing that for a long time, he said. He stopped, started again. Deciding who matters, based on what they look like, what they're carrying. He said it like a man who has just heard himself say it for the first time and doesn't entirely like the sound of it. I never thought about what it cost the other person. Ethan watched him. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Rodriguez said. I know what I did. I know how it went. He met Ethan's eyes. I'm just telling you that I know. He paused. For whatever that's worth. It was quiet between them for a moment. Not comfortable exactly, but real. The kind of quiet that exists between two people when something true has been said, and the air has to adjust to accommodate it. It's worth something, Ethan said. Rodriguez nodded. It was a small nod, brief and undecorated, but it carried the whole weight of a man putting something down that he'd been carrying wrong for a very long time. He walked to his truck, got in, drove away. Ethan stood in the parking lot for a moment, watching the truck until it turned the corner. Then he looked up. The sky was the particular shade of late afternoon blue that California does in October, deep and clean and so straightforward it almost looks painted. He stood in it for a moment, just breathing. He thought about the review board, about Marsh saying the board finds in that official, measured voice, about Johansson saying, I know what you are, about Garrett in the hallway, voice rough at the edges, saying her name is Grace. He thought about Lily asking, Are you okay, Dad? And the fraction problem, and the spaghetti, and the horse book, and the lamp going dark. He thought about his father's voice in a hallway 3 days ago. You told the truth. You stood your ground. The rest of it isn't yours to carry. He picked up his kit bag. He walked to his truck. He was going to be home before dinner tonight. He was going to ask Lily about the horse book and whether the girl had talked to any new horses today. And she was going to tell him with complete, unself-conscious authority. And he was going to sit across from her at that kitchen table and listen to every word like it was the most important thing he'd heard all day. Because it was. It always was. But the parking lot wasn't finished with him yet. Because as he reached the door of his truck, his phone rang. And the number on the screen was one he didn't recognize. But the extension was a base extension. And when he answered it, the voice on the other end was not one he had heard before. Mr. Cole, the voice said, this is Commander Holt's office. The commander would like to see you tomorrow morning. 0800. Ethan stood with his hand on the truck door. Commander Holt. Not Lieutenant Commander. Not the review board. The commander of Naval Station Coronado himself. I'll be there, Ethan said. He got in the truck. He put his hands on the wheel. He sat there for exactly 5 seconds, feeling the particular quality of that silence, the not yet knowing, the way a story leans forward in its final pages. Then he started the engine and drove home to his daughter. He didn't sleep much that night, not because he was afraid. Fear wasn't the thing keeping him awake. It was closer to the feeling he used to get the night before a deployment. Not dread, not anticipation exactly. Something in between. The knowledge that tomorrow was going to be different from today in a way that he couldn't fully map yet, and the particular alertness that came with sitting on the edge of that. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. Lily's breathing from down the hall, slow and deep and steady as a tide. The refrigerator cycling on and off. The distant sound of the ocean, which you could hear on quiet nights if you paid attention. That low, permanent murmur that had nothing to do with human trouble and never would. He thought about Commander Holt. Richard Holt had commanded Naval Station Coronado for 3 years. He was a decorated officer, 2 combat deployments, a man with a reputation for being direct and unimpressed by noise. He didn't call people into his office for small things. He didn't call them in for follow-ups on resolved review board proceedings. When Richard Holt asked you to be somewhere at 0800, something real was waiting for you on the other side of that door. Ethan didn't speculate about what it was. He'd learned a long time ago that speculating about outcomes you couldn't control was a tax on your energy that you couldn't afford. You did your preparation, you told your truth, and then you walked through the door and dealt with what was actually there, instead of the 40 versions of it you'd imagined. He was up at 5:15. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and drank it slowly, and at some point Lily appeared in the doorway with her rabbit and her in-between dream, and he pulled her close and held her for an extra second before she wriggled away toward the cereal. He watched her eat breakfast, and she talked about the horse book. The girl had talked to a new horse, a difficult one, a horse that didn't trust anyone, and Ethan listened to every word. "How does she get it to trust her?" he asked. Lily looked at him with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "She doesn't try to be impressive," Lily said. "She just stays. She keeps showing up. And eventually the horse figures out she's not going anywhere." Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment. "That's a good book," he said. "I know," said Lily. He was at Commander Holt's office at 0755. The aide showed him in at exactly 0800, which told him something about the man. That he was the kind of person who respected a stated time the way he respected everything else. Precisely. Commander Richard Holt was 53, trim, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of a man who had long since stopped feeling the need to fill space with movement. He was standing when Ethan entered, not behind the desk, but in front of it, which was a choice that meant something. He extended his hand. "Mr. Cole," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation, sir," Ethan said. Holt gestured to a chair. They both sat, not across the desk from each other, but in the 2 chairs angled toward the window, which was another choice that meant something. Less official, more direct. "I've spent the last 2 days reading your file," Holt said. "Your complete file. Not the employment record. Everything." Ethan waited. "You served with 3rd Battalion, 75th Rangers," Holt said. 3 deployments, 11 field commendations, a Purple Heart that you apparently keep in a shoebox. He looked at Ethan with something that might have been amusement in a lighter moment. "Your CO from your 2nd deployment described you in his evaluation as..." He glanced at a paper on the table beside him. "The most quietly capable soldier I have commanded in 20 years. Lacks any interest in recognition. Deeply and completely reliable. The kind of man you want in the room when the room gets hard." Ethan said nothing. "You're also the medic from Kunar province in April of '09, Holt said. "Master Chief Garrett briefed me yesterday." He paused. 6.5 minutes of direct fire exposure. 3 Rangers stabilized. 1 medevac reached in time because you made a decision that most men, most trained, decorated combat operators, would not have made.
There were men who needed help, Ethan said. I had the training to help them.
That's a modest way to describe what you did.
It's an accurate way, Ethan said.
Holt looked at him for a moment. Then he set the paper down. "I want to tell you something, Mr. Cole, before I tell you why I asked you here. I want to tell you that what happened in that mess hall 3 days ago, the incident itself, your conduct during the review, your conduct in the parking lot with Rodriguez, all of it. I watched the footage. I read the statements. I talked to Marsh and Johansson and Garrett. All of it." He held Ethan's gaze. "In 30 years of military service, I have seen a lot of men in difficult situations. Men under fire, men under institutional pressure, men whose character was being tested in public in ways they hadn't asked for." He paused. "What you showed in those 3 days, that's not common. Not what you did in the mess hall. What you did after. The way you handled Reese's call.
The way you handled Rodriguez in the parking lot." He stopped. "That's not common. I just tried to do the right thing," Ethan said. "I know," Holt said. "That's exactly what I mean." The room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the base was going about its morning. Men and vehicles and the organized motion of a place that ran on discipline and purpose. Ethan sat with his hands on his knees and waited. "Here's why I asked you here," Holt said. He leaned forward slightly. "We have a position that has been vacant for 4 months. Director of Base Security Operations. The man who held it retired in June. 30 years in. Good man. Left big shoes." He paused. "The position is a civilian GS-13 appointment. It oversees all security personnel on this installation, coordinates with Base Command on threat assessment and protective protocols, and works directly with my office on Special Operations Security integration." He looked at Ethan. "I want you to consider it." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. "Sir," Ethan said, "I'm a checkpoint supervisor. You're a Ranger-trained, combat-certified, 3-deployment medic with 11 field commendations who has been functioning as a checkpoint supervisor because nobody looked at your file closely enough." Holt's voice was completely flat. "That changes today." He paused. "If you want it to." Ethan looked at him. He felt the weight of it, the offer, the shift, the particular way the ground moves when something you'd stopped expecting suddenly stands in front of you with both hands out. He'd spent 2 years building a quiet life. 2 years of checklists and kit bags and being the background man, the overlooked man, the man with the clipboard. And he'd built that life on purpose. He'd chosen it with intention, because Lily needed a father who came home, and the world she was growing up in needed one less man chasing the next thing. But this wasn't the next thing. This wasn't him chasing anything. This was the thing coming to find him. This was the institution, the one he'd served, the one he'd given 8 years and 3 deployments and the scar on his forearm to, looking at him finally and saying, "We see you. We know what you are. And we'd like to use it properly." "I need to think about it," he said. "Of course," Holt said. "There are things in my life that come before this." "I understand that." Holt held his gaze. "And I want you to know, whatever you decide, this installation benefits from having you here in any capacity. That's not flattery. That's a fact I needed to say out loud." Ethan nodded. "I appreciate that, sir." "Take the week," Holt said. "Talk to whoever you need to talk to. Then come back and tell me." He stood. Ethan stood. They shook hands again, and this time the handshake felt like something different than it had 20 minutes ago. Like a beginning, rather than a formality. Ethan walked out into the morning. He found Garrett at the bench near the East training field, a bench where, he would later learn, the Master Chief ate lunch every day, regardless of weather, alone, with his coffee and his thoughts. It was not quite 10 a.m., but Garrett was there anyway, and when Ethan sat down beside him, neither of them made much of a production of it. They sat for a moment, looking at the field. "Holt talked to you," Garrett said. Not a question. "Yes." "What did you tell him?" "That I needed to think." Garrett nodded slowly. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "You know what I think you should do," he said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I think I do." "But that's not why you're sitting here." "No," Ethan said. He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 2 years making myself small," he said. "After the discharge, after Sarah left. I told myself it was for Lily. And it was, partly. She needed stability. She needed me present. She needed a father who wasn't trying to be something impressive." He stopped. "But part of it was something else. Part of it was, I'd given a lot. To places that were hard and far away and full of things that cost me pieces of myself I didn't know I was paying until they were gone." He looked at the field. "I came here to be quiet, to be enough for one person in a way I could actually sustain." Garrett said nothing. He drank his coffee and listened with the full, unhurried attention of a man who knows the difference between a conversation that needs an answer and one that needs a witness. "Holt's offer isn't small," Ethan said. "It's not a checkpoint. It's not a clipboard. It's real responsibility. Real weight." He paused. "And I'm not afraid of weight. I've never been afraid of weight." He looked at Garrett. "I'm afraid of losing the thing I came here to build. The quiet. The consistency. The being there every morning at 5:15 when Lily pads down the hallway." Garrett turned to look at him. His face was the face of a man who has been a father for 30 years and a soldier for 30 years, and has spent a long time understanding the precise and unresolvable tension between those two things. "My son is a structural engineer in Portland," Garrett said. "He calls me every Sunday. We talk for about 45 minutes. He tells me about his kids, I tell him about the base. We argue about football." He smiled slightly, a brief, private smile. "I missed a lot when he was growing up. I was deployed. I was training. I was building the career." He paused. "I regret some of it. The honest answer is, I regret some of it." He looked at Ethan directly. "But I don't regret who I was. Because Danny grew up knowing his father was a man who showed up fully to what he believed in. And I believe, that is also something a child needs to see." He held Ethan's gaze. "You can be present for Lily at 5:15 and be director of base security. Those are not opposites. The question is whether you can be fully yourself in both places at once." He paused. "And from what I've seen of you, Ethan, that is exactly what you already are." Ethan sat with that for a long moment. He thought about Lily describing the horse, the difficult one, the one that didn't trust anyone. "She doesn't try to be impressive. She just stays." He thought about 7 years of staying, of showing up, of the specific and daily discipline of being a father in a way that asked everything of him and gave everything back. He thought about a road in Kunar province, and 6.5 minutes, and the decision to stay when leaving was survivable. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. Not once. Not in the field, not in the parking lot, not in the mess hall. He had never left when it mattered. The review board, not in the mess hall. He wasn't going to start now. "I'm going to take the position," he said. Garrett looked at him. "I'm going to take it," Ethan said again. "And I'm going to be home every night before Lily's bedtime. I'm going to be at the kitchen table when she does her fractions. I'm going to read about the girl and the difficult horse until Lily knows every word of that book and starts a new one. And I'm going to do this job the way I've done everything else, completely and without apology." He looked at Garrett steadily. "Those things are not opposites. You're right about that." Garrett nodded. He lifted his coffee cup slightly. Not a toast exactly, but something like one. Something quiet and complete. "Your father would be proud," Garrett said. Ethan looked at him. He felt it land, all the way down, past the professional composure and the combat stillness, and the years of learning to carry things without showing the weight. He felt it land in the place where he was not a medic or a ranger or a security supervisor or a director of anything, but simply a man who had loved his father and lost him, and carried him forward the only way he knew how, by trying to be, in every hard moment, the thing his father had raised him to be. "Thank you," Ethan said. And it carried more than the 2 words could hold. But Garrett heard all of it. Ethan knew he did. He called Holt's office from the parking lot at 10:47. "Mr. Cole," the aide said. "Tell the commander I accept the position," Ethan said, "and tell him I'll need the complete security operations brief before end of week." A pause. "I'll pass that along, sir." "Sir." He noticed it. He let it pass. He drove home to pick up Lily from school that afternoon. Her school let out at 2:45 on Thursdays, and he always tried to be there when he could. He stood on the sidewalk outside the front entrance with the other parents and grandparents, and when Lily came through the doors and spotted him, she broke into the full-body run that only 7-year-olds can sustain, backpack bouncing, rabbit sticking out of the side pocket where she always kept it. She hit him like a small freight train, and he caught her and lifted her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. "You're here," she said against his shoulder. "I'm here," he said. She pulled back to look at him with that particular scrutiny she had. Those dark eyes that saw more than they were supposed to, that had been seeing more than they were supposed to since she was old enough to ask if he was okay and mean it. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it seriously. "Like when you finish a hard thing," she said. "But the good kind of finishing, not the tired kind." He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, backpack and rabbit, the one person in the world who could read him like a book, even when he'd spent 30 years learning to be unreadable. He thought about everything that had happened in 4 days. The mess hall, Garrett's office, the hallway and the envelope, the parking lot and Rodriguez's face, Commander Holt and the offer and the bench by the east field, and the thing Garrett had said about being fully yourself in both places at once. He thought about a road in April, and a 23-year-old named Danny, and a 7-year-old in Portland named Grace, who would never know the specific geometry of the moment that made her possible. He thought about his father. He thought about West Texas, and you told the truth. You stood your ground. The rest of it isn't yours to carry. He thought about Lily asking if fractions were stupid, and him saying no, they're hard, and hard means you haven't figured it out yet. He set her down. He took her hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home. You can tell me about the horse." She grabbed his hand with both of hers, the way she always did, both hands completely committed. And they walked to the truck together in the afternoon light. And she talked the whole way, and he listened to every word, like it was the most important thing he'd heard all day. Because it was. Because she was. Because this ordinary, irreplaceable, walked to the truck moment was the thing that everything else had been protecting. Every hard choice, every moment of standing still when flinching would have been easier. Every time he had looked at a difficult thing and decided that the truth was worth whatever it cost, all of it had been in service of this. Of getting to this sidewalk on this afternoon, holding this particular hand. Ethan Cole had never been the loudest man in the room. He had never needed to be. He had been, for as long as he could remember, simply the man who stayed, who showed up fully, who told the truth, who stood his ground not because he needed the world to know what he was made of, but because he knew, and that had always been enough. It was enough now. It had always been enough. And it always would be.